Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore the inner workings of your own mind?
Always up for a good mental workout.
Awesome. Well, today we're diving into Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow. This book, I think, gives us like a whole new language for thinking about how we think.
It's a real game changer.
Totally. So the core idea here is that our minds operate on two systems, right? System one, which is all about fast, intuitive thinking, and system two, which is slower and more deliberate.
You got it.
And by understanding these two systems, we can get some fascinating insights into how we make judgments, how we make choices, and why we sometimes make decisions that seem, well, a little irrational.
Absolutely. And trust me, once you start seeing the world through this lens of system one and system two, you'll start noticing it everywhere.
Okay, so let's break down these two systems. System one, I'm picturing this as like the one that's always running in the background, like making those snap judgments. Is that accurate?
Exactly. It's automatic, effortless, and it's fueled by emotions and instinct. Think about like recognizing a friend's face in a crowd or swerving your car to avoid an accident, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's all about speed and efficiency.
So it's like our inner autopilot. What about system two then? What's its role in all this?
System two is the more analytical, thoughtful part of your mind. It's what you engage for those complex calculations, for reasoning through arguments, or making those deliberate choices.
Gotcha. So if I'm like struggling with a tricky math problem, that's my system two kicking in, right?
Precisely. But here's the thing. System two, it's kind of lazy.
That sounds familiar.
Right. It much prefers to let system one take charge whenever possible. And that's where things can get a little, well, interesting. Because system one, as efficient as it is, it's also prone to, well, biases and errors.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how these two systems like interact and maybe how those system one biases can kind of sneak in?
Oh, absolutely. There's this classic problem, the bat and ball problem. Okay, so a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost?
Okay, let me think. 10 cents.
Uh-huh. See, that's your system one jumping in with that quick, intuitive answer. But if you engage that system two, if you kind of think it through, you'll find the correct answer is actually 5 cents.
Oh, wow, you're right. I totally fell for that.
Yeah.
So even with a pretty simple problem, our intuition can lead us astray.
Exactly. And it shows why it's so important to sometimes slow down and engage that slower, more analytical system two before jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
Kahneman calls these mental shortcuts that system one relies on, he calls them heuristics.
Heuristics.
Right, and they're incredibly useful for making quick decisions, but they can often lead to these predictable biases.
Heuristics, biases.
Right.
It's starting to feel like my brain has a mind of its own.
In a way, it kind of does. Take the availability heuristic, for example. This is where we judge how frequent something is, like an event, based on how easily we can recall examples of it.
So if something is more vivid in our memory, like more memorable, we're more likely to overestimate how often it happens.
Precisely. Think about plane crashes. Statistically, they're extremely rare. But, if you just saw a news report about one, you might feel a lot more anxious about flying.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's because that event is more, available in your memory, so it feels more probable, even if it's statistically less likely.
Wow, so our brains are playing these tricks on us, using these mental shortcuts that don't always reflect reality. Are there other heuristics that we should be aware of?
Oh, tons. Another common one is the representativeness heuristic. This is where we judge the probability of something belonging to a certain category based on how similar it is to, well, to a stereotype of that category.
Stereotypes. That sounds like a recipe for biased thinking.
Oh, it definitely can be. Kahneman uses this example, the Linda problem. Imagine you're told about this woman, Linda, who's super concerned about social justice and, discrimination, and then you're asked, is it more likely that Linda is a bank teller or a bank teller who's also active in the feminist movement?
I'd probably say the latter, even though logically I know it can't be more likely just because it's a more specific category.
Right. Most people fall into that trap because the description fits their stereotype of a feminist, but it highlights how system one often ignores like statistical probability and jumps to conclusions based on these superficial similarities.
So we're making these snap judgments based on very limited information and often kind of ignoring the bigger picture.
Exactly. And you know what Kahneman calls this?
What's that?
What you see is all there is, or WYSIAD. Our system one is like a master storyteller.
A master storyteller.
It creates these coherent narratives, even if they're based on incomplete information. It doesn't bother to seek out the missing pieces or consider those base rates, the statistical likelihood of something actually happening.
So we're constantly creating these mental stories to make sense of the world, even if those stories aren't entirely accurate.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to develop this awareness of these mental processes so we can recognize when our intuition might be leading us astray.
So how do we get better at, recognizing those moments when we need to kind of slow down and engage our system too? Is it like constantly second guessing ourselves?
Not necessarily, no. It's more about cultivating a healthy skepticism towards our own intuitions, especially in situations where the stakes are high. And a great place to start is understanding how these biases play out in our actual decisions, particularly with things like, money and risk.
Ooh, that sounds like a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive.
hmm
What happens when these two systems clash in the realm of financial decision making? I'm hooked.
That's where Kahneman introduces one of the, I think, most impactful ideas from the book, prospect theory. And it's a real challenge to how we traditionally think about, how people make decisions.
All right, I can't wait to hear more about this prospect theory in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We've covered a lot of ground already, from the two systems of thinking to those sneaky heuristics and those biases that can trip us up.
It's been a real eye-opener, but we left off on a bit of a cliffhanger with this whole idea of prospect theory.
Ah, yes, prospect theory. It's a fascinating challenge to traditional economic theory, and it really gets to the heart of why we often behave in ways that seem, well, irrational, even to ourselves.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me. What is this prospect theory all about?
Well, at its core, prospect theory says that when we make decisions, we're not just weighing the objective value of different options, we're also heavily influenced by our perceptions of gains and losses. And those perceptions aren't always rational.
So it's not just about, like, the cold, hard facts, but also how we feel about those facts.
Exactly. One of the key insights of prospect theory is that we tend to feel the pain of a loss much more strongly than we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Kahneman calls this loss aversion.
Loss aversion. So, like, losing $10 feels way worse than finding $10 feels good.
Precisely. And this loss aversion can lead us to make some pretty interesting choices. For example, imagine you're offered a gamble where you have a 50% chance of winning $100 and a 50% chance of losing $50. Would you take that bet?
Hmm. Probably not. Even though the potential gain is bigger, that potential loss just feels too risky.
That's loss aversion at work. Most people would rather avoid a potential loss, even if it means missing out on a potential gain.
Fascinating. So this loss aversion, it's like a built-in bias that pushes us towards playing it safe.
In a way, yes. And it explains why we often cling to what we have, even if it might be in our best interest to let go. Kahneman calls this the endowment effect.
Endowment effect. What's that all about?
It's the idea that we tend to value things we own more highly than things we don't, even if those things are objectively the same. There's this classic experiment with coffee mugs where people who were randomly given a mug were suddenly unwilling to sell it for a price that others were willing to pay for an identical mug. Simply owning the mug made them value it more.
That's so strange. Just the feeling of ownership changes our perception of value.
It really does. And you see this play out in all sorts of ways, from how we negotiate salaries to how we make investment decisions. We become attached to what we have and are reluctant to part with it, even if it's not really in our best interest.
This is really making me think about all those times I've held on to something for way too long, just because I didn't want to let go.
We all been there. But understanding these biases, like loss aversion and the endowment effect, can help us make more rational decisions, especially when it comes to things like finances or negotiating deals.
It's like we need to learn to detach ourselves from those emotional attachments to make clearer decisions.
Exactly. And another key insight from prospect theory is that how a choice is framed can dramatically influence our decisions, even if the options are logically equivalent. Remember those framing effects we talked about earlier?
Oh yeah, like those scenarios about saving lives versus losing lives. It was amazing how the way the options were presented changed my whole perspective.
That's the power of framing, and it highlights how our emotions and our perceptions play such a huge role in our decision-making, even when we think we're being perfectly rational.
So how do we avoid falling prey to these framing effects? It feels like we're constantly bombarded with messages designed to manipulate our choices.
Awareness is key. By understanding that our choices can be swayed by how options are presented, we can take a step back and try to evaluate the information more objectively.
It's like we need to develop our own framing detectors to spot those subtle manipulations.
Precisely. And this awareness has implications for everything, from marketing and advertising to public policy. By understanding how framing works, we can make more conscious choices and avoid being manipulated by those who know how to exploit these cognitive biases.
This is all incredibly insightful. We're really starting to see how deeply these cognitive biases are embedded in our thinking and decision-making.
And we're just getting started. There's so much more to uncover in thinking fast and slow. We haven't even touched on the fascinating interplay between our experiencing self and our remembering self.
Our experiencing self and our remembering self. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, that's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. Get ready for some truly mind-bending insights into how our memories shape our perception of happiness and well-being.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We've covered a ton of ground already, those two systems of thinking, heuristics, biases, prospect theory, framing effects. It's been a wild ride.
It really has. And we've arrived at what I think is one of the most thought-provoking parts of Kahneman's work.
Yeah.
The idea of two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one. You mentioned earlier that these two selves don't always see eye to eye, especially when it comes to how we evaluate our experiences. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, think about it this way. Imagine you're on vacation, you're at this amazing beach, soaking up the sun, feeling the sand between your toes. You're totally present in that moment, right?
Yeah, I can picture it now.
That's your experiencing self, living it up in the present. But later, when you're back home and you're reminiscing about that trip, that's your remembering self taking over. It's constructing a narrative about the experience.
So it's like our remembering self is the editor of our life stories.
That's a great way to put it. And here's the catch. The remembering self doesn't always tell the most accurate story. It tends to focus on, the highlights, the peak moments, and the ending, rather than the entire experience as a whole.
I see. So we remember trips based on the best parts, the most exciting things that happened, and how it all wrapped up.
Exactly. Kahneman calls this the peak end rule, and he illustrates this with his research on colonoscopy.
Colonoscopies, not exactly the most enjoyable experience.
Right. Definitely not known for being pleasant. But what he did was he asked patients to, report their pain levels throughout the procedure. And then later, he asked them to rate how unpleasant the whole experience was overall.
Okay, what did he find?
Well, he found that the overall ratings were really influenced by two things: the peak intensity of the pain and how the procedure ended. So even if the colonoscopy was pretty short, if it ended on a particularly painful note, people would remember the whole thing as way more unpleasant.
So even if most of the experience was manageable, that final painful moment just like tainted the whole memory.
Exactly. And this has, huge implications for how we design experiences, whether it's like a medical procedure or a vacation or even like a product interaction. If we want to create a positive memory, a lasting impression, we need to focus on those peak moments, make sure there's a satisfying ending.
It's like those movies that have incredible climaxes and those really satisfying resolutions. You walk out feeling good, even if some parts of the movie were kind of slow.
Great analogy. And this whole peak end rule thing, it makes you wonder about like how we evaluate our lives as a whole, right? If our memories are kind of, shaped by this bias, are we potentially misjudging the overall quality of our lives based on just a few of those really salient events?
So it's like we're creating highlight reels of our lives.
Right. Focusing on those big wins, dramatic moments, and kind of downplaying all the ordinary, everyday stuff that happens in between.
So where does that leave us? Should we be striving for these really intense peak experiences, even if it means like sacrificing some of the more mundane everyday joys? Or is it better to have, a balanced life with those highs and lows?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's
Yeah.
no easy answer. I think it really comes down to your individual values and preferences, but at least by understanding this whole interplay between our experiencing self and our remembering self, we can become more aware of how we're shaping our own narratives and make choices that align with what really matters to us.
That's really powerful. This entire deep dive has been amazing. We've really gone deep into how our minds work, uncovered those hidden biases, and learned how we can become better decision makers.
And that's the beauty of thinking fast and slow, right? It gives us this framework, this powerful way of understanding why we think the way we do. It helps us become more conscious in our choices, whether it's, a big life decision or just something small in our everyday lives.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. Knowing what you now know about your own mind, what changes will you make? How will you approach decisions differently?
We hope this deep dive has equipped you to tackle those decisions, big and small, with a little more awareness and a little more clarity. Keep those system twos engaged.
That's it for this deep dive into thinking fast and slow. Thanks for joining us.